Baker Botts, LLP, provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice and are not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. This communication may constitute attorney advertising.
Welcome back to the Environmental Evolutions Podcast. I'm your host, Linn Bumpers. Today, we are talking about PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, and diving into what the regulatory landscape of these substances might look like under the second Trump administration. With me today, I have Martha Thompson, a partner in our Environmental Safety and Incident Response Group here at Baker Botts. Martha, do you want to start off by reminding our listeners what exactly PFAS are?
Thanks, Lynn. And of course, for anyone who hasn't listened to our previous PFAS episodes, PFAS is an umbrella term for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is a mouthful. These substances have extremely strong carbon-fluorine bonds, which allow them to imbue moisture, grease, heat, and stain resistance in consumer and industrial products. Unfortunately, the same products that give PFAS these useful characteristics also make them highly persistent and long-lasting, and EPA and other agencies have been evaluating their impacts on human health and the environment.
Right. And could you give us some examples of the consumer and industrial products that PFAS have been used in?
Anything from food and cosmetic packaging to cookware, medical devices, and clothing, electronics, furniture, firefighting foam. There's incredibly broad usage.
And that's part of why I find PFAS so interesting. Not only does PFAS seem to be relevant in many different industries and products, but the scientific and regulatory developments are also always in flux. We are constantly getting new information on how PFAS may affect people, industries, and the environment. Let's dig into today's topic: recent developments in the PFAS regulatory space and what changes we might expect to see in the next few years. Martha, do you want to start off by talking about the somewhat new EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin and his role with PFAS?
So, looking at Administrator Zeldin's background and initial actions does give us some insight on what PFAS policy may look like in the near future. When Zeldin was a U.S. representative in Long Island, he was engaged in bills addressing PFAS pollution and is a founding member of the PFAS Congressional Task Force. If you look at his bio on EPA's website, he specifically flags his experience with PFAS. In addition to his background in PFAS, he's already taken a few big steps that signal his interest to keep PFAS at the forefront of EPA's regulatory agenda under this administration.
And those are some of the things we're about to talk about. I think one of the biggest signs of his engagement with PFAS was the April 28th press release, in which EPA and administrators outlined the initial goals for addressing PFAS. EPA shared that its actions are guided by three priority principles. And those three principles are: one, strengthening the science; two, fulfilling statutory obligations and enhancing communication; and three, building partnerships. EPA identified over 20 different discrete actions under each of these principles, and talking about each of those would take an entire podcast. So, Martha, for each of those three buckets that EPA identified, could you pick one action that EPA listed that you're paying attention to the closest?
Sure. I'll start off with the strengthening the science priority. EPA noted that they will be releasing an annual update to the PFAS destruction and disposal guidance, which I know is of interest to a lot of folks.
Yes. Currently, that guidance gets released every 3 years. And I know we frequently get questions asking us about the best ways to dispose of different PFAS contaminated media. So it will definitely be helpful to have the newest science-based guidance issued every single year, particularly since there are still lots of data gaps and uncertainties when it comes to PFAS disposal. Moving on to the second bucket, which includes fulfilling statutory obligations. I know for me, this was the most interesting list, covering EPA actions on the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, RCRA, EPCRA, TOSCA, and all of the alphabet soup that comes with the really interesting regulatory developments. If you had to pick just one of the actions EPA is planning to take related to statutory obligations, which one caught your eye?
Really hard to pick, but I'll go with the potential for EPA to change TOSCA's Section 8 reporting requirement. That reporting requirement impacts a huge range of companies and industries, and it's one that a lot of companies have spent significant time grappling with over the past year.
For any listeners who are not deeply familiar with Section 8A7 of the Toxic Substances Control Act, TOSCA, this is a new statutory requirement authorized by Congress in 2020, requiring EPA to collect certain data on PFAS. Now, not only is this exciting because, we don't always get new environmental statutes coming straight from Congress, as the regulations are currently written by the Biden administration, anyone who has manufactured or imported PFAS, including imported PFAS containing articles with any amount of PFAS in them since 2011, is required to report to EPA. There is no de minimis threshold of PFAS. So even if an importer didn't know an item had PFAS, they still have to do due diligence and may be required to report.
Yeah, it is such a wide ranging rule that we've had to work with companies who really had to report under TOSCA before. The press release does not say too much, but it does specifically mention that EPA does not want to overburden small businesses and article importers. We still don't know exactly how the reporting rule will be changed, but we definitely expect something.
This is very nerdy to say, but I think this is super exciting. EPA has already extended the reporting deadline for that rule 2 times, but I cannot wait until the next EPA update on this. Lastly, was there anything that struck you under the third priority, building partnerships?
Yeah, I think the most interesting bullet here for me is probably that EPA plans to advance remediation and cleanup efforts for PFAS contaminated drinking water supplies in states. It'll be interesting to see if EPA is able to promulgate regulations that could relieve the burden on drinking water utilities to remove PFAS from drinking water by cleaning up sites that release PFAS as source waters and keep cleanup costs from being passed down to consumers.
Thank you. It's clear from those priorities that the Trump administration is not planning to back off PFAS, but let's talk about how the actions and strategy under the Trump administration is similar to and different from the Biden administration on PFAS. I can start off with looking at some of the similarities. Clearly, addressing PFAS has been and still is a priority. Both administrations have focused on science and information gathering and coordinating with Congress on bipartisan PFAS legislation, as well as fulfilling those statutory mandates required by EPA. And we've also seen that both administrations adhere to the polluter pays model.
There are some important similarities, and I think this is an area where we may see more continuity across administrations compared to other areas of environmental regulation. And to your point, I do think both administrations adhering to polluter pays is notable. It seems like there's consistent bipartisan consensus on that point when it comes to PFAS cleanup. There are important differences. It's looking like the current EPA may attempt to preempt stricter PFAS regulation by using risk management authority, which is interesting. EPA under Trump also seems more focused on PFAS air emissions, which was not a focus under the Biden administration. And I think there's some chance that this administration will change some of the Biden era rules, such as the Safe Drinking Water Act, National Primary Drinking Water Regulations, as well as TOSCA's Section 8 reporting rule.
Speaking of changes, shall we talk about some of the specific changes and challenges to EPA rules that we've seen recently? And since you are the CERCLA expert, should we talk about the challenges to the CERCLA PFOS, PFOA listing rule?
Sure. I am always happy to talk about CERCLA. I'll start off with possible changes to the designation of PFOA and PFOS, CERCLA hazardous substances, which may be to some degree up in the air under the second Trump administration. So as a refresher, PFOA and PFOS are 2 PFAS that have garnered significant regulatory attention. They were designated as hazardous substances under CERCLA in May 2024 under Biden's EPA. But I'll note that that designation process actually started under the first Trump administration, which is important. The designation means that if there's a release of these chemicals that exceeds 1 pound, it must be reported. And if a responsible party is found to have contributed to a release that results in the occurrence of response costs, and in this case, a release of PFOA or PFOS, then they could be liable for all costs of a removal or remedial action. The designation under CERCLA in 2024, at least, contains no exemptions for firefighting foam, which is a critical tool in emergency response efforts, and no specific exemption for pass-through entities like water providers.
There's a lot of risk out there for potentially responsible parties under CERCLA. I'm sure it's somewhat related to this risk. They've named a number of other reasons, but I know a month after that final CERCLA rule in June 2024, 7 industry groups challenged the final rule. However, on February 24th, 2025, the court granted EPA's first 60-day stay, and 2 additional 30-day stays were granted on April 30th and June 2nd. Most recently, EPA filed an unopposed motion to extend the abeyance for another 45 days, again, to allow new agency leadership to determine how to proceed with the litigation and the underlying rule. The court granted this motion on July 3rd, 2025, and directed EPA to file motions to govern future proceedings by August 18th, 2025. We will keep an eye on those developments.
Yeah, we're definitely keeping a close eye on this challenge. It's not clear what EPA's position is going to be when they ultimately tell the court, here's what we're going to do with this rule moving forward. As I mentioned before, I'm a little skeptical that there will be full-scale rollback of the designation, in part because this designation was started under the prior Trump administration, unless it's replaced with something else, like, for instance, regulation under RCRA. Another possibility for EPA in reconsidering the CERCLA designation might be that it takes more of a look at the margins. For instance, potentially giving more protection or liability releases to folks using AFFF or to pass-through entities like water providers.
Definitely we'll be looking at what EPA says when that stay is lifted. I did hear you mention something that I want to talk a bit more about. I've been hearing about a potential shift to regulating PFAS under RCRA rather than CERCLA, and I'm curious to know what you've heard about this rumor.
I've heard the same rumor. I think there is a chance that the Trump administration might consider moving over to RCRA as the primary mechanism for addressing PFAS contamination, but it's unclear. And CERCLA and RCRA are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So it'll be interesting to see where the administration heads on this issue.
Interesting. Turning the page to PFAS and drinking water, on May 14th, 2025, EPA issued a press release announcing plans to modify and rescind parts of the national primary drinking water regulations for certain PFAS. The press release outlines EPA's intent to extend the compliance deadlines for PFOA and PFOS from 2029 to 2031. The press release also announces a plan to rescind the MCLs for the other 4 PFAS chemicals. EPA expects to propose this rule in fall 2025 and finalize it in spring 2026. But the requirements for water systems to regulate PFOA and PFOS will still be in effect. This rule has been challenged by industry groups, but has been stayed.
Yeah, this is a big one and could have potentially big implications for compliance costs. For our listeners, I'll note that public water systems is a really broad category and includes non-transient, non-community water systems that supply water to the same 25 plus people for more than 6 months out of the year. And in non-legalese, what that means is public water systems can include employer-supplied water. So if you're an employer supplying water, this rule has potentially significant implications for you.
That's a good point, Martha. I'll go ahead and mention some of the changes we've seen to TOSCA's PFAS reporting rule that we discussed earlier. This has a one-time reporting requirement for any company that has manufactured or imported PFAS or PFAS-containing articles since 2011 and has no de minimis exemption. This sounds like a lot of work for the regulated industry. However, on May 13th, 2025, EPA extended the reporting deadline from January 2026 to October 13th, 2026. This might mean that EPA is going to consider the original reporting rule as well. In the meantime, we have some extra time to manage compliance efforts.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how things are going to play out with the reporting role, especially since it was a stated priority in the press release and because it's been a big deal for a number of companies and industries over the past year. We definitely have a few interesting years coming up on PFAS.
It will be an interesting few years indeed. It looks like we're coming to an end to our conversation. Martha, do you have any concluding remarks?
Yeah, so I think the bottom line is that the second Trump administration could significantly alter the current PFAS regulatory landscape. For regulated industries, this could mean some relief from compliance burdens, but it could also lead to difficulties in figuring out what the new requirements are and how they might apply to a specific product or industry.
Agreed. It is a complex and continuously evolving landscape, making it crucial to stay informed. Thank you, Martha, so much for joining me to discuss these updates. It was great talking with you. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in, and thank you, Blair Buchanan, for assisting with the preparation for this podcast. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this Baker Botts podcast. Baker Botts has the experience, knowledge, and people to address our clients' most significant legal issues. For more information on Baker Botts practices, please visit us at bakerbotts.com. This presentation is provided by Baker Botts LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.